Today's block that we'll be working on from the Dear Jane quilt is block G-4, also called Shutterbug. Now this one looks pretty intimidating, but I think the easiest way will be to paper piece this block. But before we get started, I want to show you a couple of things. This block, of course, it starts with a very tiny little square in the middle. But if we look at the drafting that Brenda did for the block in this quilt, we'll notice that there is something a little different when we come to this outer triangle. She did not add this extra triangle for this block. I am trying to follow the original blocks that Jane Stickle made as closely as I can. So I kind of stewed over this of how exactly to do that. And basically, all that needs to happen is an extra triangle added in there. So I copied this pattern. My printer's on its way out of the ink, so it's looking a little funky. But I photocopied the pattern and then I drew in just this extra triangle all around, and then also these lines here. With this block, as I'm making it, I'm going to be paper piecing. So in order to paper piece, we'll start with the very center, which looks to be the muslin or the background fabric that you've chosen. So it's a little bit easier to see here than in my printed. But you can see that very first one, the center is the background fabric. I'll cut out the center and I'll have just a small little piece and I'll probably glue it to the back of my paper. And then I'll start working on paper piecing all 4 points. So we'll have the very center will be the muslin, and then I'll just start working around in a circle. So I'll have basically 1, 2, 3, 4 that I paper piece, and then switching to back to the background and go 1, 2, 3, 4 around, and then paper piece the next one, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 going around, then 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the last one, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I have a feeling that's where my paper piecing will stop, because then I'll need to piece these triangles here individually and then sew them to the corners. So that's the plan. We'll see how well it goes when I start working on them. My fabric that I've chosen for today is pink, and it's this one. It's got a bunch of cute little clowns and circus type things on there. So my main fabric, my focus fabric, will be this pink, and my background will be the muslin. Since this pattern is completely symmetrical all the way through, I don't need to worry about trying to flip any images. But I'm going to start with the very center of this, and this block is going to be perfect for all these little scraps that I have from past Dear Jane blocks. So I'm going to get a square, and this is much too big, but it will allow me to get started. So I'm going to look, and I could see the outline of where that block center is. So I put a little bit of glue, and then I'm going to put my fabric right in the middle. And what that does is that will hold my fabric in place so I don't have to pin. Now with this, I've got that right in the center, so I'm just going to pick one side to start my paper piecing. And I've done this on other blocks, so I won't walk you through the whole thing. But I'm just getting one side ready to stitch. So I just have this one side. You can see on the back, there it is. I will just cut probably this little square here. Now I know at first it looks like paper piecing has a lot of waste, and it does, but it's just easier to have it a little bit bigger than what I need. Now I know that my fabric will need to be face to face here, right sides together, because what I'm going to do, instead of sewing through the paper, I'll sew right along this line here. I pin through the paper just so that it doesn't move on me. And I've got my thimble on, I'm ready to sew. So I'm just going to sew this seam right here. And you can see I'm just sewing right along the edge, not into the paper. And then I finger press that open, and that's my first seam. Now when I'm just going around the circle, well, it's around the square, but it's in a circular fashion. So I have this seam. I'm just going to go to the very next one. And I do the exact same thing. And now you'll see I'm trimming both of those fabrics. And now I'll take another piece of this pink. And I line it up. When I'm lining it up, I can see the faint lines of the copy of this, so I'm just making sure that this is centered over that so that I don't mess anything up there. And this is a small enough seam. I'm actually not going to pin it. And we'll see if I have enough thread. I'm getting right to the end there. Yep, just enough. Okay. Trim that, and then I will press that open. And there we have the beginnings of this. So I'm going to continue to go around this circle, this square. Actually, I'm going to continue to go around this square with all 4 of those. And then I'm going to continue the same process as I go around each one, as changing the fabric as I need to match the pattern. One thing that I should mention is make sure to press really well. I only did some finger pressing, but I'm actually going to take this over to the iron and press these down really well. The more you press, the easier it is to get the nice crisp seams that you need when you go around. Progress on the block is going really well. I have put a pin in the very center now that I'm working further out, just to keep this from coming apart. I know it's glued on the paper, but that could easily come apart too. On this side, I kept getting confused on which was my focus fabric and which was my muslin background. So I went ahead and just kind of colored in where my focus fabric is. So it's, I'm currently working on this piece here. I've already trimmed it and folded it, so I'll need to cut some more muslin pieces that are getting a little bit bigger to finish out the rest of this center part. I am now working on the outer border of this particular block, so I just wanted to show you where I am on this. The pieces that I am now sewing on are these background pieces. They kind of look like triangles, but they really aren't. They're cut off, they're shortened, and in the book when you look at them, it looks like the triangle comes all the way out into the sashing into the next block, and I think that's just the illusion of the sashing strips in between and it being the same color. But regardless of that, what I'm doing for these parts are sewing in rectangles, and then I will be trimming those. So let me flip this over so you can see. You see this piece and this one are just rectangles. I just have one more to go, but as I'm sewing these, they end up being too long, and I can use that for the block. So I'm actually going to trim this fabric, and I should be able to use that. So this ruler is an add a quarter ruler, and so it has 1/4 of an inch right on the end there already marked, and I'm going a little bit beyond that just because I want a little bit of room for being able to trim up the whole block. And in looking at this, it may not be, it will be, I think it'll be long enough or deep enough. So I'm going to be working on this part to get this sewn on there. So I'm going to turn it this way because this is the way that I'll work. I have my bookmark to crease, and then I will put my ruler down to add that 1/4 of an inch. Oops. All right. Move those to the side. Now I have a nice straight edge there to stitch my final piece on for this. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to line this up there. And when I turn this down, I can see that my seam is lined up. And I'll pin that so I can sew it. And I will have plenty of seam allowance for that block. Okay, so I'm going to pin this, I'm going to sew that, and then we're going to talk about those corner triangles. I've trimmed all 4 of the corners, and basically what that meant is I folded up that corner and then trimmed that 1/4 of an inch. Each of the corners is independent of each other, so I won't have to worry about any of them overlapping. And I went ahead and cut off one of the corners so that we can actually stitch this piece so that'll go in here. And so they'll be going right along the corners there. Now for this corner piece, it doesn't really matter which way I go, but some of these triangles that are left over from when I was cutting off the pieces on the other sections, I can use. I'm going to use this as my template for sizing, but I know that my triangle, see when I put it up there, right here is the triangle. If I put it up, that's going to be that 1/4 of an inch. There's plenty of room on the bottom for that seam. So what I'm going to do is actually get strips of the muslin, and I have several that are left over from just trimming off different things. So I will just sew a muslin strip on there, and I will, let's see, if I measure this, we're looking at, it needs to be a quarter of an, yes, this is a quarter of an inch, so it needs at least a quarter of an inch for that seam allowance. So I need half an inch to show, and then a quarter-inch seam allowance sewn in. So we're looking at 3/4 of an inch minimum. So if I have a strip that's at least an inch, which this is just over 1¼ inches, then that will give me enough room for sewing what I need to. So I will see what kind of strips I have already, and if I don't have any scraps, then I will just cut 1-inch wide strips and sew them to 4 of these triangles. I'll sew one side and then sew on the other. I now have 4 of these triangle sections sewn, and I need to trim them. When I look at my little template piece, I can line up the, let's see, I've got on my ruler, I'm not sure how well that'll show up, but I have a 45-degree angle line here, and that's where I'm going to line up my triangle. And I line up the edge of my triangle on that line, so I can have my piece right here, but I need to have that 1/4 of an inch. So I slide it up so I have a 1/4 of an inch here, and I have my line, and the point of this triangle, see right here is where the next line is. My point is at the 1-inch line. So when I line up my triangle, I will line up one side of the angle, and the point right up at that 1-inch line, and that'll give me the line for where I need to trim. So here is my triangle, and I can see it much better than I can with the paper. So here's my point right at that 1-inch spot, and my line is right there. So I know you're going to get a bit of a glare from my light on the ruler, but I can line that up. I've got that line there. So I'll start with just marking that. So I have my line drawn, and then I have a 45-degree angle on this other side also. So I can just slide that over. And once again, my point is at the 1-inch. This side, the line is right on that angle. There we go. Now I'll have a line that I can cut. Now you can either cut with the rotary cutter at this point or scissors. Since I have my rotary cutter out, now I can line that up. And now I'm trimmed along this bottom part. So this is a 1/4 of an inch ready to sew on. And here we have one piece that is already trimmed, and I've got it pinned along this line. When I'm holding it up to pin, one good way to see if it's lined up is to just flip up your triangle here and just see that it looks even there. It's a pretty simple way just to be able to see, yep, it's lined up. And once that piece is stitched on, so I've got that line there stitched and pressed, then you're going to get that. So I'm going to stitch all 4 and then I'll be able to trim this block. All 4 triangles are now sewn down and now the block is ready to trim. So I will, you might get a little bit of a glare, but lining up my ruler, I can line that center right up in the center of that square, and then the lines are going right through each of those triangles, right through to the corner all the way down. So it lines up really well. Okay, got 2 sides trimmed. I'll turn it, put it at a little bit of an angle for it's easier for me to trim. Now I can line up those 2 sides as well. Trim the rest of the block. There we have the finished block. This was block G4 Shutterbug. I hope you enjoyed following along as I made this block. If you have any questions or comments, you can always leave them down below, or you can send me an email at soitseemscreations@outlook.com. If you enjoyed this video, you can always like and subscribe, and you can hit the notification bell to let you know each time I upload a video. This is Veronica Johnson with Sew It Seems, and I'll see you next time.